Story number 1.
I first encountered the desert in the summer of 2008 when I accepted a job offer in the Mojave for a geological survey team. Um, the money was good, and I was eager for the work. It sounded simple enough. Spend a few months gathering data about seismic activity, studying the layers of rock and soil beneath the desert, and writing reports. It was the kind of solitary work that I enjoyed. But there was something about the desert that unsettled me. I had never been to the desert before, and the stark beauty of it both intrigued and unnerved me. The endless stretches of sand, the craggy outcrops of rock, the way the horizon seemed to stretch into infinity. It was a world completely different from the bustling city life I was used to. It felt silent in a way that made my skin prickle. The heat was unbearable during the day, the air dry, and the evenings were colder than I expected. But the worst part of all was the isolation. There was a deep loneliness out there, something that gnawed at the edges of your mind, something you could almost taste in the air. I arrived at the small outpost, a collection of trailers and tents surrounded by a few sparse cacti and scrub brush, just as the sun was beginning to dip beneath the distant mountains. The workers who greeted me seemed nice enough. There were only a handful of us on site, and most of them had been living out here for months, which made them used to the heat and the isolation. A man named Bill, the supervisor, took me around the trailers and introduced me to the rest of the crew. "Don't worry," Bill said as he handed me a cup of coffee that I didn't really want. "You'll get used to it. This place grows on you. Just stay busy, and the days go by faster." I tried to smile politely, but I wasn't sure I believed him. That first night, as the temperature dropped and the wind howled through the cracks in the trailer, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. There was something in the air, a presence, as though the desert itself was alive and aware of my every movement. The work started the next morning, and it wasn't long before I realized that the desert was not as desolate as it seemed. There was an eerie stillness to the land, and the geological survey sites were scattered throughout areas that hadn't seen human activity in decades. Most of the time, I worked in pairs, setting up equipment, recording data, and performing routine checks on the seismic sensors. But there was one location, an old mining site just outside of the outpost, where I was asked to go alone. The site had once been a thriving silver mine, but it had been abandoned after a series of accidents, including the deaths of several miners. According to Bill, it had been shut down after an explosion tore through one of the shafts, leaving the area toxic and dangerous. The company had long since pulled out, and all that remained were the rusted ruins of the mine, a few crumbling structures, and the ghostly remnants of the past. I was skeptical of the stories that Bill and the others told about the place. Most of the time, people in the desert resorted to ghost stories to pass the time. It was a way of dealing with the overwhelming isolation, the relentless heat, and the oppressive quiet. But one thing I couldn't ignore was the strange feeling I had whenever we drove past the mine. Even in the bright light of day, the place seemed to pull at me, like it was trying to keep me close, like something there wanted me to stay. The first time I went to the mine was uneventful. It was hot, dusty, and quiet as I set up the equipment. I tried to focus on the task at hand, but the air felt thick and the wind carried with it an odd whispering sound that seemed to come from nowhere. It was as though the desert itself was speaking to me, warning me to leave. I laughed it off. It was just the wind, I told myself. Nothing more. But the second time, things were different. I had driven out to the mine early in the morning, hoping to get the work done before the heat became unbearable. The sun had barely risen when I set up my equipment and began my checks. The wind was still, the air unusually heavy. I wasn't sure why, but it felt like the desert had become too still. The silence was unsettling, like a vacuum, as though sound had no place here. I didn't think anything of it at first. The morning was hot, and I was used to the oppressive dry heat that made every breath feel like it was laced with sand. But as I began to work, I noticed something strange. The ground near the old mine shaft seemed disturbed. It wasn't just the usual scuffing of my boots in the dirt. It was as though something had been walking there, leaving behind deep, uneven footprints. I stepped closer, trying to see more clearly in the morning light. The footprints were strange, long, deep, and almost animalistic, but the ground around them was undisturbed. No other tracks, no signs of animals. It was as though something or someone had been walking there in the night. I shrugged it off, convincing myself that it was just another oddity of the desert. The wind could have created strange patterns in the sand, I thought. After all, the desert played tricks on your mind all the time. I finished my work quickly, eager to leave, but as I walked back to my truck, I heard it. A voice, a whisper, soft at first, then clearer. It wasn't English, at least not any language I recognized. It was low, almost guttural, like it was coming from somewhere deep beneath the earth, and it was calling my name. Elliot. I froze. Elliot, help me. I turned around, scanning the desolate landscape behind me. There was no one. The mine stood still, its jagged outlines casting long shadows on the ground. The wind picked up again, sending dust swirling through the air, but the voice remained. I should have left right then, but I couldn't bring myself to move. Something about the voice, though faint and distant, kept me rooted to the spot. And then I saw it. Just at the edge of the mine, near the entrance to the shaft. A shadow. It wasn't large, but it moved in an unnatural way, slowly, deliberately. At first I thought it was a trick of the light. But no. There it was again. Something moving inside the mine, something that shouldn't be there. Without thinking, I stepped forward, my heart racing in my chest. The shadow lingered for a moment longer, then disappeared into the darkness of the mine. I didn't want to go inside, but something urged me forward. Something deep inside me told me that I had to investigate, that I had to understand what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the mouth of the mine, my footsteps echoing in the silence. The air inside was cold, almost frigid, and I could taste the dust in my throat. I shined the light around, but there was nothing. The shaft was empty, the walls lined with ancient timber and rusted equipment. But the further I went in, the colder it became. The whispering continued, distant but unmistakable, and the deeper I ventured, the more it seemed to come from all directions. Suddenly, I stopped. I felt it. A presence, a heaviness, like something was watching me. It wasn't the usual feeling of being in a dark, abandoned place. It was something far more unsettling, something that chilled me to my core. I spun around, but there was nothing. No one. Just the darkness and the oppressive silence. That's when I heard the laughter. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, more distinct, until it was ringing in my ears. High-pitched, cruel, and full of malice. It echoed through the shaft, bouncing off the walls until it seemed to surround me. My breath caught in my throat. The laughter wasn't human. I stumbled backward, panic rising in my chest, and I turned and ran. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The laughter followed me, growing louder, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. I burst out of the mine, gasping for air. My heart pounded in my chest, and I couldn't get away fast enough. I ran all the way back to my truck, slamming the door behind me and locking it. For a moment, I just sat there, trying to steady my breathing. The desert was still, silent. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the cracks in the rock. I never went back to that mine. The following week, I left the Mojave, a place that had seemed so full of promise, now reduced to a memory that haunted me. I didn't speak about what had happened. It was too strange, too terrifying to put into words. But every time I closed my eyes, I heard the laughter. And every time the wind picked up, I swore I could hear someone whispering my name. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The desert was never a place I feared. I grew up in Nevada, and the barren expanse beyond the edges of our little town was just part of the backdrop of life. My dad used to say the desert had a kind of memory, like it soaked up every footstep, every whisper, every bad decision. At the time, I thought it was just his way of making sand and heat sound poetic. That was before I learned how right he was. It started with a research trip. I was working on my master's in anthropology, focusing on indigenous trade routes in the Mojave. My thesis advisor suggested I spend some time in the field, so I applied for a small grant, loaded up my truck with gear, and headed out toward the Old Spanish Trail, a section far from any popular hiking paths. The plan was to spend 5 days documenting petroglyph sites, gathering samples, and mapping out features. I wasn't supposed to go alone, but my field partner backed out last minute. I convinced myself I'd be fine. After all, it wasn't my first solo trip. I arrived at the site in early October, just when the desert starts to cool at night but still burns in the day. I parked the truck at the edge of a dry basin, shouldered my pack, and began the hike in. I had marked a place on the map, a shallow canyon with rumored rock shelters and old pictographs. Nobody had documented it thoroughly, and I was hoping it might hold something new. The first day was uneventful. I reached the canyon by late afternoon, set up my tent near a low ridge, and started cataloging what I saw. Sun-faded spirals on the walls, crude animal figures chipped into stone. I took hundreds of photos, filled a notebook with sketches, and recorded my voice notes. That night, I sat outside the tent watching the sun fall behind the hills, the sky going orange, then purple, then black. The silence in the desert at night is so complete it feels manufactured, like the sound has been vacuumed out of the world. That night, I had a strange dream. I was walking through the canyon again, only it wasn't dry anymore. A narrow river snaked through the middle, and along the banks were dozens of small fires. Figures sat by them, some wrapped in furs, others in blankets, whispering in a language I didn't know. As I passed them, they all turned to look at me. Not threatening, just watchful. I woke up sweating, my heart racing, though the air around me was cold. I chalked it up to nerves and went about my second day. That morning, I found a small path leading out of the canyon. It was mostly buried, but the stones were arranged in a way that couldn't be natural. They formed a kind of staircase up into the hills. I followed it, thinking it might lead to a better vantage point for mapping. At the top was a plateau, flat and empty except for one thing, a stone circle. About 10 feet across, low to the ground. The rocks were blackened, not by fire, but by time. At the center was a flat slab of rock, almost like an altar. It was colder up there, which didn't make sense. The wind was still and the sun was out. I took a few photos, scribbled down some notes, and decided not to linger. Something about the circle made my skin itch. That evening, I started hearing things. At first, it was faint, a distant tapping, like pebbles knocking together. Then it turned into whispers, too low to understand. I kept checking around the tent, expecting to find animals or wind playing tricks. Nothing. By midnight, the whispers became clearer. They were voices. Not speaking English, not Spanish, they rose and fell like chants. I turned on my headlamp and stepped outside, heart pounding. The desert was empty. The voices stopped the second I unzipped the tent. I didn't sleep. The third day, I tried to keep busy, climbing the ridge, sketching more of the petroglyphs, but I felt watched. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone standing just out of reach. The shadows felt longer than they should have been. And around noon, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. On the side of the canyon wall, just above the shelter where I had pitched my tent, was a new marking. A figure, tall, thin, arms outstretched. I knew it hadn't been there before. I would have photographed it. It wasn't etched like the others. It was smeared in what looked like rust-colored paint. Or blood. I packed my things and decided to hike back to the truck. I didn't care about the grant or the research anymore. I needed to leave. But when I reached the truck, something was wrong. The tires were flat. All four. Not slashed, flattened, like someone had let the air out. I opened the door, trying not to panic, and checked the battery. Dead. No reason for it. It had been new. I tried the radio. Nothing. Not even static. I was stuck. There was a small emergency beacon in my gear. I set it up on a rock near the truck and activated it. It was supposed to send a ping every 30 minutes. If I didn't check in, someone would come looking in 2 or 3 days. I set up camp by the truck. That night, the voices came again, louder, closer. I sat up with my flashlight, scanning the darkness. The light barely reached the edges of the basin. I could feel something out there. It was like being underwater and knowing a shark was circling just beyond visibility. Then I saw them, figures standing on the ridge, 5 or 6 of them, unmoving, not walking, not approaching, just watching. Their outlines shimmered slightly like heat waves, though the air was cool. One of them lifted an arm and pointed at me. I ran into the truck and locked the doors. I stayed there until sunrise. When I stepped out the next morning, they were gone. But the stone circle from the plateau was now 10 feet from the truck. Identical, same size, same black stones. I hadn't seen anyone move it. I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't eat that day. My mouth was dry no matter how much water I drank. The sun felt hotter, but the sky was clouded over. That night, the voices didn't just whisper, they screamed. Inhuman, guttural sounds, echoing across the basin like a war cry. And then I heard footsteps, hundreds of them, shuffling, circling the truck. I covered the windows with my sleeping bag and curled into the passenger seat. I clutched my knife, though I knew it would be useless. I must have passed out at some point, because I woke up just before dawn. Everything was still. The circle was gone again. Not a single footprint in the dust. I stepped outside and saw something that made me collapse. There were markings on the truck's hood, not scratches. Carvings, deep gouges that formed symbols, circles, eyes, spirals, and a tall figure with arms raised. The same as the one on the canyon wall. That broke something in me. I don't remember much of the hike back. I walked for miles, probably 40 or 50. I don't know how I didn't die of heat or exposure. I think something let me go, or followed me. A rancher found me stumbling along a dirt road, sunburned and raving. I spent 2 days in a clinic. I told them I got lost. They chalked it up to heat stroke and isolation. I never said a word about the voices or the symbols. Weeks later, a ranger found my campsite. He said it looked like it had been abandoned in a hurry. The truck was there, but there were no carvings, no circle, just sand and rocks. But he did say one thing that chilled me. "You left a journal," he said. Most of it was weather notes, sketches, but the last page was different. He pulled out a photocopy and handed it to me. Scrawled in my handwriting, though I don't remember writing it, were 5 words. They remember, they still live. I quit the program, moved to Oregon, as far from the desert as I could manage. Sometimes I still hear whispers at night. I check the windows, but there's never anyone there. Sometimes I see that figure from the canyon in my dreams. Watching, waiting. I think about going back sometimes, not to find answers, just to make sure it's still there, that it didn't follow me, but I won't. I know better now. The desert remembers everything. Story the end.
Story number 3.
I was 32 when I left Phoenix. Not for good, just for a while. I needed a break, and I needed it to be far from people, traffic, and noise. The desert always gave me that. There's a peace to the dry heat, the endless horizon, the complete disinterest the land seems to have in human problems. It doesn't care if your boss is a jerk or your marriage is falling apart. It just is. So when a friend of a friend offered me the use of a vacant ranch house he managed near the New Mexico border, I didn't hesitate. It was in the middle of nowhere. I mean that literally. You could drive for 30 miles in any direction and not see another building. The nearest gas station was in a town called San Lucero. Population maybe 80, if you counted dogs. The ranch house sat at the base of a small mesa and looked out over nothing but dry brush, yucca plants, and faded cattle fencing. No internet, no cell reception, just a landline phone inside that barely worked unless you stood near the kitchen window. I arrived on a Friday morning in late October. The sky was bone white with heat, and the wind carried grit that stuck to your lips. The house had been vacant for about 8 months, ever since the owner, an older man named Vernon, passed away. It was small, but solid. Thick adobe walls, wood beam ceilings, and a porch that wrapped around 3 sides. There was a small windmill out back and a generator for power. A water tank sat buried next to the house, and somehow still worked. Inside, it smelled like dust, old wood, and dry sage. I swept, opened the windows, and unpacked the few things I brought. Books, canned food, a rifle for snakes, and a box of vinyl records I played on an ancient turntable I found in the living room cabinet. I didn't need much. I just wanted quiet. The first night passed without incident. The stars were ridiculous. I sat on the porch for hours just staring up, listening to the wind. Around midnight, I heard coyotes in the distance. Nothing strange for the area. I went to bed early, letting the silence wash over me. It wasn't until the 3rd day that things started to feel off. It began with a noise. I was inside making coffee. Early morning, sun not quite over the mesa yet, when I heard something slam against the side of the house. Not a soft bump, not wind. A solid, 2-handed slap, like someone hitting the wall. I grabbed the rifle and ran out the front door. There was no one there. I walked the perimeter. The dust was undisturbed. No footprints, no tire tracks. Nothing. I waited outside for a good half hour, watching the horizon, looking for anything. Eventually I went back inside, chalking it up to maybe an animal knocking something over. Though I knew that wasn't it. It was too deliberate. Later that afternoon, I drove into San Lucero for supplies. The general store was half empty. The guy running it didn't say much, but I asked him if he ever heard anything weird about the old ranch house off Route 19. He didn't look up from the register when he answered. "Which house?" I described it. "Adobe, next to the mesa, with a windmill and two old trucks rusting behind the barn." He frowned. "Vernon's place?" "Yeah." He paused. "He died out there, heart attack, alone." I nodded. "I heard." Found him 2 days later. Sheriff said he was trying to use the radio. Said it looked like he'd been scared of something. Scared? That's what the sheriff said, but people say stuff. What kind of stuff? He finally looked up at me. "You hear things out there sometimes, see things, but that's just the desert. It gets in your head." I thanked him and left. But the way he said that last part stuck with me, like he was repeating something he'd been told, not something he believed himself. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared, just restless. The wind was heavier. It whistled around the corners of the house, tugging at the windows like fingers. I put on a record, an old blues album, and let it play while I sat on the porch. That's when I saw something. Far out in the desert, maybe 200 yards from the porch, something was moving. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a stray dog or coyote, but it was upright, human-shaped. I stood, narrowed my eyes. It wasn't walking, it was swaying, like it was trying to decide which way to go. I called out. It stopped. Then it turned, slowly, and vanished. Not walked away, not ran, just disappeared. 1 second it was there, the next it was gone, like a mirage blinking out. I didn't sleep that night either. Over the next 2 days, the house got louder. Doors creaked open on their own. The kitchen faucet would turn itself on, just a drip, drip, drip. The lights flickered, though the generator was solid. The worst was the smell, like burnt hair and wet earth. It would come and go, mostly in the hallway near Vernon's old bedroom. I started dreaming too. Same dream every night. I was in the desert, walking away from the house. The wind was howling. I'd look back, and the house would be on fire, but no smoke. Just flame. Inside the flames, I'd see someone standing watching me. And always, in the dream, I heard whispering. A voice I couldn't understand, but that sounded like it was behind me, no matter where I turned. By the 5th night, I was ready to leave. I told myself I was being irrational, that the isolation was getting to me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the house didn't want me there. That it was watching me, learning me, figuring out what scared me most. That night, everything escalated. It started with the wind. Around 2 a.m., it stopped completely. No breeze, no rustle of dry grass, dead silence. I sat up in bed, sweating. I'd left the windows open, but the air felt thick like being underwater. I could hear my own heartbeat. Then came the knock. 3 sharp bangs on the front door. I grabbed the rifle and crept to the living room. The porch light was on. Nothing moved outside. I stood at the door, listening. Another knock. Louder, longer. I flung the door open and aimed the rifle. Nothing, but there were footprints in the dust, bare feet, small, leading away from the door and into the desert. I followed them. Maybe 100 yards out, the prints just stopped. No turn, no fade, just stopped like the person vanished mid-step. I spun around, looking for anything. That's when I saw the light. It was coming from the mesa, a dull orange glow pulsing behind the ridge like firelight. But no smoke. I'd never seen anything like it. I started walking toward it. I don't know why. I wasn't thinking. I was drawn to it, like gravity. As I approached the base of the mesa, I heard the whispering again. Loud this time, angry, like a dozen voices overlapping, all speaking in a language I didn't understand. I should have turned back, but I climbed the ridge. Hands and knees, rifle slung over my back. The glow got stronger, more intense. My skin started to feel tight, like it was drying out from the inside. When I reached the top, I saw it. A pit, circular, maybe 10 feet across, carved into the rock, too perfect to be natural. The light came from inside it, and standing around it, holding hands, were figures. They were tall, thin, and wrong. I couldn't tell if they were wearing robes or if their skin just hung from them like cloth. Their faces were smooth, no eyes, no mouths, but they turned to look at me all the same. I fell backward, scrambled down the ridge, and ran like hell back to the house. I didn't look back. I slammed the door behind me, locked it, and curled up in the corner of the kitchen until the sun rose. I left that morning. Didn't pack. Didn't shower. Just took the keys and drove until I saw pavement again. I called my friend from San Lucero and told him I was done. He didn't ask why. A week later, I heard the house burn down. No one knows how. No storm, no lightning. It just went up in flames in the middle of the night. They found nothing left, not even the windmill. I don't go into the desert anymore. Not alone, not even for a day. I live in a city now. Concrete, people, traffic. I miss the silence sometimes, the peace. But then I remember the pit and the way those things turned to look at me. Story, the end.
Story number 4.
I was 29 when I took the job out in Sonora. I'd been laid off twice in 2 years and had just about drained my savings trying to stay in Phoenix. A buddy of mine from college, Derek, reached out with a strange offer. He'd picked up contract work out near the Mexican border, installing and servicing surveillance equipment for a private company with a government grant. They needed another set of hands, and it paid decently. The catch was, it meant living out in the middle of nowhere for stretches at a time. I didn't even hesitate. I packed my gear, sold my TV, and drove south. Our base was a prefab station set about 20 miles from the nearest paved road near a scatter of old copper mines. The company, Vigil Corps, was doing something with AI motion sensors, the kind that could detect movement over wide terrain and categorize it automatically. We were supposed to install and maintain sensor hubs across a few hundred square miles of harsh desert. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was quiet and paid on time. Derek and I shared a double-wide trailer with 2 other guys, Alex and Victor. They were cool enough, kept to themselves mostly. We worked in pairs, rotating shifts so there was always someone at the base, while the other 2 were either sleeping or out doing checks. You'd drive 30 miles down dirt roads, hike a few hundred yards into nowhere, clean sand out of equipment, replace solar panels, upload diagnostics, then move to the next station. The desert changes you. Not in some mystical sense, at least not at first. It's more that the silence gets in your head. You realize how much noise follows you in regular life. Cars, power lines, people, music. And out there, it's just wind, grit, and the occasional buzz of a power inverter. And after a while, that stillness begins to feel like it's watching you. It was Alex who first mentioned the woman. We were sitting outside one night, knocking back warm beers and staring at the stars. The moon was a thin slice of silver, and everything felt stretched and brittle. "You ever seen her?" Alex asked, mostly to no one. "Seen who?" Derek replied. "The woman in white. Walks the flats, always out past Sensor 4 Alpha." Victor rolled his eyes. "Jesus, man, don't start." "No, I'm serious," Alex insisted. "I saw her 2 weeks ago, just before dawn. She was out past the ridge, walking toward the hills." "Probably just a migrant," I offered. Alex shook his head. "She wasn't moving right. Not stumbling or tired, just walking like she knew exactly where she was going. And she was glowing, like, not flashlight glow, just faint, like moonlight was stuck to her." I laughed, but not loudly. Something about the way he said it stuck with me. It wasn't a joke. We let it drop, but over the next few days, I noticed the others acting strange. Derek barely left the trailer. Victor started sleeping with earbuds in. Alex kept asking to switch to day shifts. I figured it was isolation setting in, or boredom, or both. My turn to check Sensor 4 Alpha came 4 days later. I didn't even think about the story until I was halfway there. It was about a 2-hour drive from base, and I started before sunrise to avoid the midday heat. I bounced down rocky roads, tires kicking up dust, past empty arroyos and brittle Joshua trees. When I reached the station, I grabbed my gear and hiked the last quarter mile to the sensor. It sat in the middle of a dry wash, tucked under a ledge for shade. I ran diagnostics, brushed the solar panels clean, then checked the logs. That's when I saw it. The motion logs were time-stamped with brief activity at 3:12 a.m. every morning for the last 7 days, always the same time, always from the same direction, northwest, from a stretch of hardpan known as Devil's Flat. Each log showed a humanoid silhouette, just standing there for about 30 seconds, then vanishing. No second pass, no trail, just a blip, then gone. I copied the logs to my laptop and tried to rationalize it. Maybe a glitch, maybe the sensor was picking up a distant coyote or a heat mirage. Still, it bugged me. I stayed out there another hour watching the direction the logs came from. Nothing moved. The wind blew dust around, but that was it. Back at the trailer, I showed Derek the logs. He stared at them, then muttered, "She's doing it again." "Who?" She doesn't like the sensor being there. That's the one she always comes to. The old site. That confused me. What old site? Derek didn't answer right away. He closed the laptop and got up. There used to be a village out there, he said. Spanish colonial, late 1700s, built around a water spring. The church stood right near where 4 Alpha is now. Supposedly they all died during a drought. Some say they sacrificed people to bring the water back. I stared at him. He glanced toward the window. They say she was the last one left, watched everyone die, walked into the desert and never came back. Now she wanders, looking for the spring. You believe that? He gave a dry laugh. I believe something's out there. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared, at least, not consciously. I kept listening. The wind against the trailer, the distant creak of cooling metal. Once I swore I heard something tapping on the window, but when I looked, there was nothing but sand. I woke up around 2:30 a.m. and made coffee. I was sweating, but the air felt cold. Victor was already up, staring at the monitor. The camera feed from 4 Alpha was live. You watching for her? I joked. He didn't answer, just pointed at the screen. There she was, a tall figure walking across the wash, slowly, purposefully, wearing white, not glowing, not transparent, solid. But wrong somehow. Her arms hung straight down, too still. Her head was tilted just slightly, like she was listening. She reached the center of the frame and stopped. Then she turned toward the camera, and I swear her face was wrong. Blurred, like it refused to come into focus. Eyes too far apart, a mouth that stretched too wide. I leaned closer to the monitor, and just as I did, the screen went black. No signal. Victor looked at me. It does that every time. Why are you guys still working here? He looked exhausted, because if we leave, she might follow. I didn't understand then, but I do now. We went back to work like nothing happened. Kept running diagnostics. Kept logging. But things started to change. The equipment at 4 Alpha began to fail. Batteries drained faster, cameras froze, sensors triggered with no visible cause. Then the dream started. I'd wake up with my tongue dry, mouth full of sand. I dreamed of standing in a chapel, crumbling and roofless, watching the pews catch fire. A woman stood at the altar, hands raised, screaming silently at the sky. I'd wake up with my heart racing, lungs aching, as if I'd been holding my breath. Alex went first. He packed his things one morning and walked out, left his gear, left his radio, just walked into the desert. We didn't even notice until sunset. We found his boot prints heading toward Devil's Flat, then vanishing. No signs of struggle, no animals, just gone. The company sent a search team. They found nothing. After that, Derek refused to go out at all. He stopped speaking, sat in his room for hours, rocking slightly, muttering in Spanish. He didn't even speak Spanish before. Victor quit 2 days later. A company helicopter came and got him. He wouldn't talk to me, just kept whispering prayers. I was alone. I lasted another day before deciding to leave. I packed my truck, wrote an email to my supervisor, and started driving. About 15 miles from the station, I saw her. She stood in the road, barefoot, white dress whipping in the wind that wasn't there. Her face was clearer now, like someone had tried to paint a human face but didn't quite understand the proportions. She didn't move, didn't blink. I slammed the brakes and swerved. By the time I stopped, she was gone. I didn't stop driving until I hit Tucson. That was 2 years ago. I don't sleep much anymore. I keep a lamp on in every room. Sometimes I wake up and find dirt on my floor, even though I lock my doors. Once, I found a small stone circle in my backyard. I dismantled it, but the next week it was back. I moved last year, different city, didn't tell anyone where. But last night I turned on the TV and saw static. The image flickered, and for a split second I saw her face again. I know what she wants. She wants me to go back, to finish what I started. But I won't, because I know now she doesn't wander. She waits. Story the end.
Story number 5.
In the summer of 2019, I was working as a freelance photographer specializing in environmental and abandoned location photography. I'd built a small but loyal following on social media, and my work was gaining traction, enough to fund a long road trip through the American Southwest. The trip was meant to be a creative reset, a way to break out of my comfort zone and find locations that most people wouldn't bother photographing. I had mapped out a route from Nevada down through Arizona, planning to hit a few ghost towns and forgotten stretches of desert. One place that kept coming up was an area west of Flagstaff called Red Earth Basin. It didn't appear on any recent maps, but several explorers and urban photographers on niche forums had mentioned it. The stories were inconsistent. Some said it was an abandoned mining settlement. Others described it more like a collection of scattered structures and vehicles half swallowed by the desert. There were warnings, too. People claiming strange occurrences, disorientation, feelings of being watched. But online communities like that always come with a healthy dose of exaggeration. I assumed it was just folklore. Still, the idea fascinated me. I found GPS coordinates posted by a user who claimed to have visited 3 years earlier and decided I'd go, spend a night or two, and document what was left. It was far from any paved road, but I had a Jeep Wrangler with a roof tent, extra gas, and emergency gear. I told my brother and a friend where I was going, sent them my route, and promised to check in by satellite messenger every evening. The drive into the desert was brutal. I left the last gas station around noon and drove 5 hours through dusty, unmaintained roads. By the time I arrived at the edge of the basin, the sun was setting. The air had a red hue from the dust and sun mixing on the horizon. The terrain was strange, flat in some places but rising into jagged, petrified formations that looked like frozen waves of rock. It was eerily quiet. Not just the absence of traffic or people, but the complete lack of birds, insects, or any ambient noise. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I parked near what looked like a collapsed structure, maybe an old cabin or store. The wood was bleached and brittle, the roof sunken in. Around it were the remains of rusted equipment, half-buried tires, and a skeletal windmill. I took a few photos, but the lighting was fading fast, and the air had turned cold in that sudden desert way. I set up my tent, ate a cold meal, and crawled into my sleeping bag, planning to start exploring at dawn. That first night, something felt off. I don't scare easily, but the atmosphere was heavy, claustrophobic, even in the wide open. I kept hearing faint noises. Not animal sounds, but faint clicks or taps, like someone running their fingers along metal. Once or twice, I thought I heard footsteps crunching over gravel near the Jeep, but every time I unzipped the tent and shined a light, there was nothing, just empty space and the rusted ruins of whatever this place had been. At 3:12 a.m., I woke up again. The tent was shaking, not violently, just barely, like someone was brushing it with their hand. I stayed completely still. I thought maybe it was wind, but everything outside was dead calm. I reached for the flashlight and unzipped the flap slowly. The second I opened it, the shaking stopped. Again, no one was there. But about 15 feet from the Jeep, there were fresh footprints. Human. Barefoot. The desert floor was dry and cracked, so the prints weren't deep, but they were unmistakable. They led away from the camp toward the darker side of the basin, where a rock formation jutted out like a half-buried ship. I didn't sleep after that. At first light, I packed up the tent, but left the Jeep in place. I wanted to explore for a few hours before heading out. I hiked toward the center of the basin, where the structures became denser. Pieces of homes, a rusted-out school bus, what looked like the entrance to a mine shaft that had collapsed long ago. There was a kind of pattern to the way everything had fallen, like it had been hit all at once by something violent, not over time. Doors were off their hinges, windows broken from the inside out. I found a weathered sign sticking out of the ground that read Marietta. No other context. I assumed it was the name of the settlement. Inside the bus, I found a child's backpack, torn at the straps, and a metal lunchbox still containing a rusted thermos. I took photos, careful not to move anything. The silence was more intense now. I hadn't even seen my own shadow move for what felt like an hour. As I was heading back to the Jeep, I saw someone. A woman. She was standing behind a warped fence post, maybe 30 yards away, partially obscured by blowing sand. She wore a long white dress that looked gray with dust. Her face was turned slightly, not looking at me directly. I froze. My mind raced. Was she lost? Injured? But there was something off. Her skin looked pale, not sunburned pale, chalk pale. And she didn't seem to be breathing, just standing. I called out, raising a hand. Hello? She turned her head slowly and looked at me. Her eyes were pitch black, not shadowed, not inhuman, just black, like holes had been drilled into her skull. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Then she raised one hand and pointed behind me. I turned. There was no one behind me. When I looked back, she was gone. I don't know how I got back to the Jeep. I remember running. I remember the sudden sting of wind and sand in my face. When I reached the vehicle, I started it and drove without thinking. I didn't follow the GPS, just drove until the sun was directly overhead and the terrain started to look familiar again. It took me nearly 9 hours to find a paved road. I didn't stop until I reached a small motel just outside of Holbrook. I checked in, locked the door, and showered for what felt like an hour. That night, I tried to review the photos I'd taken. Everything looked fine until I reached the shots I took just after seeing the woman. In one of the wide shots of the ruined buildings, just past the center of the frame, there was a figure, standing still, pale, wearing white. I hadn't seen her when I took the photo. I zoomed in, and her head was turned, not toward the camera, but toward something else, something outside the frame. She was pointing again. I clicked forward. In the next shot, she was gone. Just empty ground. I never posted those photos. A few months later, I tried to find the forum post that had led me to Red Earth Basin. The user who'd shared the coordinates was gone, account deleted. All of the threads mentioning the place had been closed or removed. I contacted the Bureau of Land Management, asking if they had any historical info on a town called Marietta near the coordinates. The woman on the phone said there had never been a settlement by that name in the area. But when I pressed, she got quiet. Then she said, "Some places don't make the records. Doesn't mean they were never there." I haven't returned to the desert since. I stick to city shoots now. Crowds, buildings, bright lights. The night still feels different sometimes, especially when it's quiet. Once in a while, I'll be reviewing a photo, usually an old one, and think I see something in the background, a flicker, a figure, a shape that's too still, always dressed in white, always pointing. Story the end.
Story number 6.
Sure. Here's a new, original, realistic, ghost scary story set in the desert. It contains over 2,500 words with no chapters or instructions, just the story. I took the job out in the Mojave because I was desperate, plain and simple. I'd just gotten divorced, I was behind on rent, and my freelance gigs had dried up like everything else during that long, cursed summer. So when I saw a listing on a government subcontractor board for a temporary field technician in Baker, California, remote, hot, isolated, 3-month minimum, I didn't think twice. The recruiter made it sound more intense than it was, probably to scare off casual applicants. But all I'd be doing was monitoring ground sensors set up in the desert, making sure they weren't being tampered with or malfunctioning. It was mostly automated. The sensors were part of some border monitoring program, even though we were miles and miles from the actual border. It didn't matter to me. The pay was decent, and I needed to be away from the world for a while. They set me up in a company trailer about 20 miles south of Baker. No neighbors, no cell signal, just a radio, an old desktop for the sensor software, a solar-powered generator system, and gallons of drinking water delivered every week. I had a satellite phone in case of emergency. The sensors were spread out across a wide grid, maybe 30 total, each about 2 miles apart. My job was to hike out to any that were flagged, either by the system or if they missed a scheduled report. I was told to expect dust damage, minor electrical shorts, maybe interference from wildlife or curious hikers. It was lonely work, but the silence was welcome. I found that I liked walking out over that dry, cracked ground, that's boots crunching over ancient lake beds and brittle creosote. At night, the sky opened up like a cathedral. I started to sleep better. I ate beans and canned stew, read books, kept a journal. I didn't think much about anything except the next hike. Then came Sensor 12. The system marked it as non-responsive one morning around 4 a.m. It hadn't checked in for 6 hours. That wasn't entirely unusual. Sometimes a unit would overheat or get hit by wind-blown debris and go offline until I reset it. I pulled up the coordinates and plotted the walk. It was one of the more remote sensors, out past an old dry wash where nothing grew, not even sage. It would be close to a 3-hour round trip, but I didn't mind. I packed water, a hat, a backup battery, and started walking before the sun got too high. The first thing I noticed as I approached the location was the absolute stillness. I know the desert's supposed to be quiet, but this was different. No wind, no insects, not even the faint clicking of rocks expanding under the heat. It felt like being in a sealed room. When I found the sensor, it was half buried in the sand, like something had tried to claw it apart. One of the antennae was bent backward, and there were shallow scratch marks across the casing, 3 parallel lines, deep and uneven, but too wide to be a coyote or bobcat. I took pictures and started to remove the panel when I noticed something in the dirt nearby. Footprints. Only they weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, small, human, leading from the sensor straight out into the desert. At first, I thought maybe someone had come out here, maybe a hiker who lost their shoes, or, more troubling, a migrant who got turned around and desperate. But the weird thing was, the footprints didn't come from anywhere. There were no incoming tracks, just a set of prints starting by the sensor and heading west. I followed them. I know now that was a mistake. The prints were light but clear, spaced evenly, like whoever made them was walking calmly, not running or stumbling. No drag marks, just one foot after the other, over dry stone and crusted sand. I followed for maybe 20 minutes, not really thinking, just drawn forward. It started to feel like a trance. Then I saw the well. It wasn't on any of my maps. No reference on my equipment, no satellite markings. It just sat there, out in the open, like someone had dropped it from the sky. Old stone, about 3 feet across, with a rotted wooden frame above it. No bucket, no rope, just a dark hole. The footprints led right up to the edge and stopped. I stood there, sweating, the sun blistering the back of my neck. I should have left, but instead I walked up and looked in. I couldn't see the bottom. It wasn't just dark. It was wrong. The way the light bent at the edge, the way the shadows seemed to move even when I was still. I felt dizzy, like I was about to fall in, even though I hadn't moved. Then I heard it. A whisper. Just one word. My name. I turned around so fast I almost tripped. Nothing was there, just the empty desert stretching forever. I ran. I didn't care about the footprints or the broken sensor. I ran all the way back to the trailer and didn't stop until I was inside. Door locked, radio blaring static. I told myself I'd imagined it. Heat stroke. Dehydration. Maybe I'd fallen asleep out there and dreamed it all. I took a cold shower, drank a gallon of water, and slept for 14 straight hours. But the dreams didn't stop. In them, I was standing at the well. Only now there was someone on the other side. A woman, pale skin, long black hair, barefoot, wearing what looked like a nightgown. Her eyes were huge and glassy, and her mouth never moved, but I could hear her anyway. She asked me to come back. I didn't. For 2 weeks, I avoided the area. I skipped Sensor 12 even when it was flagged. I made up excuses in my reports, blamed dust storms and failing equipment. Nobody questioned me. Then one night, the door to the trailer opened by itself. I woke to wind and dust blowing in. The lock was still latched, but the door stood wide. I got up, heart pounding, and saw a trail of wet footprints on the floor, bare feet leading from the door to the bathroom. When I opened the bathroom door, no one was there. But the mirror was fogged and one word was written in the steam. Come. I packed a bag that night. I radioed my supervisor the next morning, claimed there was a family emergency and I needed to leave early. He didn't argue. I was supposed to stay 3 months. I left after 6 weeks. I got as far as Barstow before my engine died. I hadn't seen a warning light. No noise, no overheating, just silence, and then the engine cut out. I coasted to the shoulder and tried to call a tow, but my phone had no signal. Not even emergency bars. I waited 5 hours in the heat before a truck finally pulled over. The driver, an old man with sun-baked skin and cataract eyes, looked at me like he recognized me. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked. I didn't answer. "She don't let go once she finds you," he said, lighting a cigarette. "You should have never looked in that well." He dropped me in Victorville and wouldn't take money. Just shook his head and said, "You can run, but she'll walk." I moved to Oregon a week later. I got a job doing IT support. I rented a second-floor apartment, avoided mirrors, and started sleeping with white noise playing in every room. But it didn't help. Sometimes I wake up and smell sand, like hot rocks and dust after a rain. Sometimes I find tiny stones in my sink, even though I haven't been outside. And last week I found footprints again, in my carpet, leading from the balcony to my bed. I don't sleep much anymore. I hear her voice in the walls, faint and coaxing. She doesn't yell, she doesn't threaten, she just waits. I don't know what's at the bottom of that well. I don't want to know. But part of me, some stupid, tired part, wants to go back, to finish the walk, to step over the edge and see where it leads. I won't, but I don't think I get to decide. Story the end.
Story number 7.
Campfire tales and overactive imaginations. That was before I went to the desert with my dad, before I saw what I saw and felt what I felt. It happened 5 years ago, and even now, I still wake up sometimes with my heart pounding, my mouth dry from the memory of dust and the silence that was anything but empty. I was 22 at the time, fresh out of college, trying to figure out what to do with my life. My dad, Hank, was a retired surveyor who spent most of his career working in the Southwest. He knew the deserts of Arizona and New Mexico like the back of his hand, and he had a habit of driving out to these desolate places every couple of months just to clear his head. It was his therapy. One day, out of the blue, he invited me to come along, said we'd spend 4 or 5 days exploring some old trails, maybe find a few abandoned settlements or mining camps, maybe even some petroglyphs. I figured, why not? A few days with no internet and no obligations sounded like the reset I didn't know I needed. We packed up his old Ford Bronco and headed out from Albuquerque, driving west into the desert. The farther we got, the more the landscape seemed to open up and swallow us. By the third day, we were somewhere deep in the El Malpais area, miles from any paved road. The rocks were blackened and sharp, remnants of long-dead lava flows, and the air had this weight to it, like the silence had mass. We set up camp in a narrow canyon, a shaded little pocket surrounded by cliffs and rock towers. There was a dry creek bed nearby and a few hardy shrubs, but otherwise it was nothing but stone and sky. That night, we built a small fire, cooked some beans and sausages, and stared up at the stars. The Milky Way looked like it had been painted across the heavens. Used to be a trail around here, my dad said, poking at the fire with a stick. Old Spanish route. Before that, the ancestral Puebloans used it. He was full of facts like that. I nodded, half listening. You ever hear of the Lost Mission? He asked suddenly. No, I said. Story goes, there was this small mission church built out here. Spanish priests, a couple dozen native converts. They were trying to avoid the main roads, too dangerous. Apaches, outlaws, you name it. Anyway, one day they just vanished. Every last one of them. No sign of struggle. No bodies. Just gone. Sounds like a legend, I said. Maybe. But the weird thing is, people have claimed to see lights out here, bells ringing in the middle of the night, chanting in Latin, and once in a while, someone disappears. I chuckled. And yet here we are, he smiled. Told you it'd be an adventure. The fire crackled. A cool breeze came through the canyon, carrying with it a strange metallic scent, almost like rust. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, certain I'd heard something. Soft footsteps, maybe, or a low humming. Once I sat up and thought I saw a flicker of light at the far end of the canyon, like a candle being carried in the dark. But it was gone before I could focus on it. I told myself it was just moonlight reflecting off the rocks. The next morning we hiked. My dad wanted to show me an old rock shelter he'd found years ago. It was a few miles from camp, so we packed water, snacks, and headed out around 9. The heat came early, bouncing off the rocks in waves. By noon, we reached the shelter, a shallow overhang tucked into a cliff face with faded handprints and spirals painted in red and black pigment. We sat in the shade and ate. My dad talked about the symbolism of the art, how spirals often meant journeys or water. Then he got quiet, staring at the canyon wall opposite us. Something's not right, he said. What do you mean? He pointed. That rock formation. I don't remember that being there. I looked where he was pointing. It was a tall, narrow spire of stone, maybe 10 feet high, leaning slightly like a crooked finger. It didn't look unnatural, but I hadn't been there before to compare. Maybe it's just erosion, I said. He frowned. Maybe? We took a different route back, moving along the rim of a wash. Around 2 p.m., we saw something strange, an old trail, partially overgrown but clearly man-made. It curved gently toward the base of a mesa. I don't remember this either, my dad muttered. We followed it. After about half a mile, we saw the walls. They were low and broken, but definitely shaped by human hands. Adobe bricks, sun-baked and crumbling. We'd found some kind of structure. We poked around carefully. Most of it had collapsed, but we found a doorway still intact, and part of a wooden beam still lodged in the wall. There were fragments of pottery on the ground, and the remains of what looked like a stone altar. My dad crouched and ran his fingers over a patch of faded pigment on the wall. This was a chapel, he said. "You're looking at the lost mission." The air got colder suddenly. I thought it was just shade from a passing cloud, but when I looked up, the sky was clear. And then I heard something, a soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone knocking gently on wood. My dad heard it too. His eyes met mine, and we stood up fast. We turned and saw movement. A figure stood at the edge of the ruins, maybe 20 feet away. It was draped in a brown robe with the hood pulled low. No face, just shadow. "Hello?" my dad called out. The figure didn't respond. I took a step forward. "Hey, are you okay?" Still nothing. Then it turned and walked into the wall. Not around it. Into it. We both ran to the spot. There was nothing there, just crumbling bricks and dry dirt. "We're leaving," my dad said. We hiked fast, barely speaking. My mouth was dry, my skin felt tight like the heat was wrapping around me. Every time I looked over my shoulder, I thought I saw movement, shapes darting behind rocks, figures watching from the cliffs. I told myself it was heat haze. When we got back to camp, we packed up. My dad didn't even bother folding the tent. He just shoved it in the truck bed. We drove out in silence, the sun glaring in our mirrors. We camped at a roadside pullout that night, near a ranger station. Neither of us wanted to be alone in the dark. Around midnight, we were still awake, sitting in the cab of the truck, windows cracked, listening to the crickets. Then came the bells. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. Church bells, ringing 3 times. My dad's face went white. He turned the ignition and drove without saying a word. We didn't stop until we reached Gallup. Weeks passed. I tried to forget. My dad refused to talk about it. He looked tired all the time, like he hadn't slept. Eventually, he started having episodes. Waking up in the middle of the night, shouting in Spanish. He never learned Spanish. Doctors called it stress-induced night terrors. Then one night, he vanished. The front door was unlocked, his truck still in the driveway, no sign of struggle, no note. No note. All they found was a single footprint in the dust outside the back door. A barefoot print. I haven't been back to the desert since. I don't go hiking. I don't go camping. Sometimes I still hear the bells, usually just after waking, but sometimes when I'm lying in bed thinking about the mission and that robed figure, I'll hear them faintly, just 3 soft chimes in the distance. I don't think it was a ghost in the traditional sense. I think it was something older, something that doesn't forget. Maybe that mission didn't disappear on its own. Maybe it was taken, and maybe my dad was taken too. Story the end.
Story number 8.
The desert is a place where the land holds its breath. The silence is unlike anything I've ever encountered. It's heavy, suffocating, and after a while, you start to feel like the desert itself is watching you. I didn't believe in ghosts at first, not in the way people think of them, wandering spirits or mysterious figures that appear in the dark. But I learned quickly that some things in the world are better left unexplained. I had moved to Arizona for work. The job was an environmental analysis position, and it brought me out to a small town near the edge of the Sonoran Desert. I was hired by a company to monitor the impact of nearby construction projects on the environment. It was a good job with decent pay, but it came with a lot of solitary work, driving out to remote sites, setting up equipment, and recording data. The more isolated the location, the better. It was exactly what I had been looking for, after years of living in a city where noise and chaos seemed to never end. Out here, in the desert, the silence was overwhelming. I rented a small place on the outskirts of town, a modest little house that I shared with no one but my thoughts. The house was an older property, a former rancher's home, and it had its share of quirks. The floors creaked with every step, and the windows rattled in the wind, which was constant at night. The walls seemed to groan under the pressure of the desert heat. But, for the most part, I liked it. It was peaceful. One morning, I was scheduled to go out to a remote site in the desert to check on some monitoring equipment. It was about a 2-hour drive from my house, and it was the kind of place I had been to countless times before. The road was long and desolate, lined with scrub brush and the occasional cactus. There was nothing for miles except for the endless horizon, where the desert stretched out like a vast ocean of dust and rock. It was always quiet out there, too quiet. Sometimes I would hear something, like the sound of a voice carried on the wind. But when I'd stop the truck and get out to look around, it would be nothing, no one. It always left a chill creeping up my spine, but I'd shake it off. I was used to it by now. The morning I went out to the site, the wind was heavier than usual. It had kicked up a fine dust, and the sun was just beginning to rise over the jagged peaks in the distance, casting long shadows across the land. I loaded up my truck with all the equipment I needed, cameras, data loggers, a few tools, and started the drive. The highway was deserted, as always, but I felt a nagging sense of unease as I headed into the vast, empty space. As I neared the site, I noticed something odd. The landscape didn't look quite right. The road I usually traveled was filled with deep tire tracks, and there was a new dirt trail cutting through the sand, leading off into the distance toward an area where I knew no one should be. It was a part of the desert that wasn't developed, unmarked by any kind of road or path. It felt off, almost as if someone had been out here recently. I slowed down as I drove closer, scanning the area for any signs of activity. My truck was the only vehicle around, but there were more tracks now. Footprints, fresh and clear, some of them larger than others. They were scattered around the area, leading toward the site. My heart rate quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm. It was probably just someone else out here doing work, or maybe some hikers who had wandered off the trail. Still, the footprints didn't sit right with me. They looked wrong. The depth of the footprints was inconsistent. Some of them were deeper than others, as if the person who made them was moving erratically. I parked the truck and got out to check on the equipment. As soon as I stepped onto the dry earth, the temperature seemed to drop. It was a strange feeling, almost like a sudden chill in the air, but the sun was high and the wind hadn't picked up in any unusual way. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and my stomach turned. There was something in the air, something different about today. I couldn't explain it, but I knew something was wrong. I made my way to the monitoring station, which was a small metal shack surrounded by a few solar panels and a couple of weather sensors. The wind was beginning to pick up, and the rattling of the shack's metal walls created an eerie, ghostly sound. I walked up to the equipment, checked the power levels, and found everything was functioning normally, but something caught my attention as I was finishing up. There was a set of footprints leading up to the shack. These tracks were fresh, and the odd thing was they were too close together, almost as if someone had been walking on tiptoe. I bent down to examine them closer, but just as I did, I heard something. A soft, distant sound carried by the wind. It wasn't a voice, but it was almost like a humming, a low, droning sound that seemed to emanate from somewhere far off. I stood up quickly, scanning the horizon. I was alone out here, or so I thought. There was no one in sight, no vehicles, no signs of life, except for the tracks in the sand. My pulse quickened, and the humming sound grew louder, almost as if it was drawing nearer. I stepped back toward the truck, my senses on high alert. That's when I saw it, a figure, standing just beyond the edge of the station, half hidden by the thick, swirling dust. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the wind or a mirage, but no. There was a person there, or something that looked like a person. It was tall and thin, with long, tangled hair that blew wildly in the wind, but its movements were unnerving. It wasn't walking, it was gliding across the sand, like it was floating. The figure seemed to shimmer in the light, as if it wasn't entirely solid. I froze, unable to move. My breath caught in my throat. I wanted to shout, to ask if it needed help, but the words wouldn't come. I watched as the figure slowly turned and started walking toward the abandoned mine shaft a few hundred yards away. It was only then that I noticed something else. Its feet. They didn't touch the ground. It was walking, but the feet didn't leave any footprints behind. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at it, too terrified to move. The humming sound grew louder, and the figure disappeared into the distance, just as the wind picked up again, sending a cloud of dust swirling around me. I snapped out of my trance and ran back to the truck, throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut. My hands shook uncontrollably as I fumbled to start the engine. The drive back to town was a blur. I couldn't stop glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure following me. The humming noise seemed to follow me too, faintly in the distance. I finally reached the safety of my small house, but the unease lingered. The desert had never felt so hostile, so alive with something I couldn't understand. I didn't go back to that site again. I couldn't. And as the days passed, I tried to push what I'd seen to the back of my mind, but the feeling never went away. It followed me everywhere, in the quiet moments in the dead of night when the wind howled outside and the desert pressed in around me. I'd hear that humming sound again, and sometimes when I walked outside, I'd catch a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye, a shadow flickering just out of sight. Eventually, I left Arizona. I found another job, somewhere far from the desert, far from the place that had haunted me. But even now, when I think about it, I can still hear the hum, and I can still see that figure, gliding silently across the sand, its feet never touching the earth. Some things are meant to be left undisturbed. Story the end.